All right, so up to this point, what snapshot testing has allowed us to do is replace the user, right? Because we can simulate all the events that the user would generate, right? Mouse movement, keystrokes, clicks, right? We can generate that. We can also, with snapshot testing, we saw that we can replace the browser, right? We can, instead of depending on the browser, we can simulate it and generate the DOM that the browser would have generated. Yes, and verify that any changes in the expected values and the actual values of the DOM are reported as defects. Yes. So another aspect that we mentioned at the beginning of the lecture was that something else that we also wanted to be able to sever or to become independent of was remote services, right? These remote services that provide this data, formatted in a particular format with arrays and JSON and objects in there. And we want to be able to also replace those as well. Okay, so for instance, a lot of our code might be written in such a way that they go out to these services, right? Using fetch or Axios or whatever mechanism or just plain old Ajax. They are going to go out and retrieve this data and come back with some data, right? And so we need to be able to sever that dependency and mock in such a way that we can test the component, and make it believe that it has access to all these services, right? When in fact we can intercept the communication, right, and provide our own data as opposed to having it go out to the server. So to do that, Jest provides a mechanism to do just that. So for instance, the mechanism that we're going to use is that we know that all our services, for instance, the user service that we looked at 2 minutes ago, the provider service, the service, the FAQ service, all those services, they use the fetch library to go out and talk to the remote server. Yes? What we'd like to be able to do is that it says, no, don't go out and fetch this. Instead, use this mocked service, right? And instead of going out to fetch some live data with data that I don't really know what's going to have, it might have thousands of records, right? And the records might be all sorts of users and providers and whatnot. I don't have control over that because that data changes over time. Yes, there's nothing that I can control over that as people use this actual live data. Instead, what I'd like to be able to do is provide a known set of pieces of data that I can control and make sure that the application behaves correctly once I give it this known set of data. So to do that, we can completely redefine the fetch function. Right? We know that all the communication between our services and our services on the client and our services, our web services, is through the fetch function. Okay? So what we're going to do is that we're going to replace it. We're going to redefine it entirely within our test. We're going to say we're going to replace it with this function here. It's a function that lives inside of the Jest library mock implementation. Mock implementation. Right? This is completely going to redefine the fetch function, so that anybody in our application, if they call fetch, instead of actually going out to the server, instead they're going to call this function, right? Which now we have full control over, right? And any arguments that the fetch function they're using, passing a URL, passing a configuration object with headers and cookies and JSON objects and whatever, whether it's a post or a put or whatever it is that we're passing, that will be passed on to us in this function that is replacing fetch. And here's an example of us receiving as an argument the URL. But we can certainly receive the other stuff, right? We could receive the configuration object would be also part of this. And here we can do whatever we want. We can respond. We can send back as a response, something that would simulate us actually going out to the server. Right, so here's an example of internally inside of this function, inside of our mock implementation, right? That we're saying if we get a URL that has this that looks like this, like user/321, then I'm going to respond with a promise. Because remember, that's exactly what the component is expecting, right? The component is expecting a promise, right? And that promise typically will have a JSON function that converts from the HTTP body into a JSON object. We can do that too, right? We can replace that JSON function to come back with whatever value we want, right? So this would be value, right? Values that we know we are sending back, and that we're expecting that the component should behave in a particular way if this is the output that is coming back from the service, right? That it should render the form in a particular way, that certain input fields should have the user values and the passwords and the first names and the last names and whatnot, right? All rendered correctly in our forms, which would be the ones that would use this this particular rendering, this particular data. Or instead, if the URL looks something like this, /users, where it would be expecting an entire collection of objects, we can mock that as well. We're going to return a promise whose object is going to have a JSON function that the user service is going to call .json on the response, and this is what they're going to get. Right, calling .json, they're going to get this array of users, right, of Alice, Bob, and Charlie. And then it would iterate over that and would render 3 rows, right, or 3 URLs or whatnot, or 3 LIs, right? So once we have that, we can actually test it. Right? We can use the user service here and do a .find user by ID, right, and verify that when it comes back, right, this would normally go out and generate a fetch. It would generate a get, an HTTP get out to the server. Instead, is going to come back with a JSON object, right? There's not going to be any HTTP calls out to the server. It's going to come back with the data, and internally we can just verify and validate that the user is not undefined, that the user ID is 321, that's for Alice, and that the username is indeed Alice, right? So we can validate this, the service as well. For the find all, we can verify that the user's array coming back is not null or not undefined, that the array size is 3, and that the user's is 1. Is that the first ID of the first user is 1.